The rolling hills of the Palouse are known for their quiet golden beauty, but in the early hours of November 13, 2022, they became the backdrop for a nightmare that would paralyze the nation. Moscow, Idaho, was a place where "lock your doors" was a suggestion, not a rule. A sanctuary for students who believed their biggest worries were midterms and football scores. That collective sense of safety didn't just break, it vanished into the freezing mountain air as 4 lives were snuffed out in a matter of minutes. Inside a 3-story rental home on King Road, a silent predator moved through the shadows with a precision that hinted at something far more calculated than a random act of rage. For 48 days, the killer was a ghost, leaving a community to suffocate under the weight of its own fear, while investigators sifted through a digital and biological puzzle that stretched across the entire country. The world watched as the name Bryan Kohberger moved from an obscure PhD student to the face of modern American horror. It was a case that redefined the power of forensic genealogy and cellular tracking, revealing how the very technology we carry in our pockets can become the silent witness to our darkest deeds. But beyond the complex web of DNA and car sightings, there was the human cost. The vibrant futures of Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan, whose stories were nearly eclipsed by the sensationalism of the trial. In July 2025, after years of legal maneuvering and agonizing delays, the tension finally broke. A guilty plea echoed through the courtroom, stripping away the mystery and leaving only the cold, hard reality of 4 life sentences. It was the final somber chapter in a story of unfathomable cruelty, proving that even the most meticulously planned crimes eventually leave a trail that leads back to the light. Help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Madison Mogan, known to everyone simply as Maddie, was the personification of warmth. At 21 years old, she was a senior majoring in marketing, a field that perfectly suited her natural ability to connect with anyone she met. Maddie had a smile that felt like a secret she was letting you in on, and her loyalty to her friends was legendary. She was often seen with her lifelong best friend, Kaylee Goncalves. Their bond was so tight that they were frequently described as 2 halves of the same soul. They had grown up together in Coeur d'Alene, navigated the awkwardness of middle school, and celebrated the milestones of high school side by side. For Maddie, 1122. King Road wasn't just a rental, it was the final clubhouse before she and Kaylee moved on to the next chapter of their lives. She was hardworking, often pulling shifts at a local restaurant called Mad Greek, where her co-workers remembered her as the kind of person who could brighten the most stressful kitchen rush with a single joke. Kaylee Goncalves was the fire to Maddie's calm. Also 21, Kaylee was a senior majoring in general studies, and she was a force of nature. She was adventurous, outspoken, and fiercely protective of those she loved. By November 2022, Kaylee was already looking toward the horizon. She had a job lined up in IT in Texas and had recently purchased a new Range Rover, a symbol of the independence she had worked so hard to achieve. She was supposed to be moving out, but she had returned to Moscow that weekend to show off her new car and spend one last celebratory weekend with Maddie. There was a sense of completion in her life. She was ready to take on the world, but she couldn't resist the pull of one more night of laughter in the house that had come to define her college experience. On the floor below them lived Zana Kernodle, a 20-year-old junior majoring in marketing. Zana was the kind of person who radiated a gritty, authentic energy. She was known for her sharp wit and her refusal to conform to anyone else's expectations. Originally from Post Falls, Idaho, Zana was a hard worker who balanced her studies with a job at the same restaurant as Maddie. Her friends described her as the life of the party, but not in a loud or obnoxious way. She simply had a magnetic personality that drew people into her orbit. Zana had found something special in Moscow, a sense of belonging, and a deep, passionate love for Ethan Chapin. Ethan Chapin, a 20-year-old freshman from Conway, Washington, was the only victim who didn't officially live at 1122 King Road, but he was a constant, welcoming presence there. A member of the Sigma Chi fraternity, Ethan was a triplet, and his bond with his brother and sister, who also attended the University of Idaho, was the cornerstone of his life. Standing over 6 feet tall with a shock of curly hair, Ethan was often called a gentle giant. He had a laid-back, easygoing demeanor that balanced Zana's high-energy personality. On any given night, you could find Ethan at the house, usually in the kitchen or the living room, making sure everyone around him was having a good time. He was a talented athlete and a lover of the outdoors, but his true talent was making people feel seen and valued. Together, these four represented the vibrant heart of the university. Their social media feeds were a testament to their joy. Photos of them at the ARB, the campus arboretum, snapshots from football games where they wore the silver and gold of the Vandals, and countless videos of them dancing in the kitchen of the King Roadhouse. They were young, they were loved, and they were entirely unaware that they were being watched. The community of Moscow thrived on this energy. In a town of 25,000 people, the university was the engine that drove everything. Residents and students mingled in the local diners and coffee shops, creating an atmosphere where everyone felt like a neighbor. The local police department was more accustomed to noise complaints and minor scuffles than violent crime. There hadn't been a murder in Moscow in 7 years. It was the kind of place where parents felt safe sending their children, believing that the biggest dangers were the icy roads in winter or the occasional overindulgence at a fraternity party. This innocence was the foundation of their lives. They operated under the assumption that the world was fundamentally good, or at least that their small corner of it was exempt from the darkness that made headlines in big cities. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, the house at 1122 King Road was as busy as ever. With the Thanksgiving break approaching, there was an air of excitement. Students were planning their trips home, finishing up projects, and squeezing in a few more nights of socializing before the campus quieted down for the holiday. Maddie and Kaylee were finalizing their post-graduation plans. Zana was looking forward to more time with Ethan, and the two surviving roommates who lived on the first floor were going about their daily routines. The house was a sanctuary of friendship, filled with the mundane but beautiful details of 4 lives in full bloom, half-finished textbooks on the coffee table, a collection of shoes by the door, and the sound of laughter echoing through the hallways. They were standing at the pinnacle of their youth, looking out at a future that seemed limitless, never imagining that a shadow was already beginning to stretch toward their door. While the world within the King Roadhouse was one of light and connection, a starkly different reality was unfolding just 8 miles away across the state line in Pullman, Washington. Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old PhD student at Washington State University, existed in a realm of clinical observation and profound social detachment. To understand the shadow that began to loom over Moscow, one must look into the history of a man who spent his life studying the very darkest corners of the human psyche, perhaps as a way to understand the void within himself. Kohberger was not a typical student. He was a man obsessed with the mechanics of crime, the psychology of the offender, and the intricate dance between the predator and the law. Born in 1994 and raised in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, Kohberger's early life was marked by a struggle for control. In his youth, he dealt with significant weight issues and social alienation, often becoming the target of bullying. Those who knew him then described a dramatic transformation in his late teens, a period where he lost a massive amount of weight but seemed to gain a sharp, almost aggressive edge to his personality. He became a student of martial arts, a discipline that provided him with a sense of physical dominance he had previously lacked. However, this newfound confidence was often perceived as arrogance. He was remembered as highly intelligent but socially abrasive, frequently challenging those around him with a cold, analytical intensity that made casual friendship nearly impossible. This analytical drive eventually found a home in academia. Kohberger pursued a degree in psychology and then a master's in criminal justice at DeSales University. It was here that his interest in the minds of killers deepened. He studied under a renowned forensic psychologist known for her work with serial killers like Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. While most students approached criminology with a desire to uphold justice, Kohberger seemed fascinated by the why, the internal state of the offender during the act. This was evidenced by a research project he initiated on Reddit, where he sought out former prisoners to answer detailed questions about their crimes. He wanted to know how they felt when they approached their victims, how they chose their targets, and what thoughts occupied their minds as they committed their deeds. He was, in essence, building a map of the criminal soul. In the summer of 2022, Kohberger moved to Pullman to begin his doctoral studies at WSU. His arrival coincided with a noticeable shift in his behavior. As a teaching assistant, he was described by his students as either a tough grader, who was distant and robotic, or as someone who would suddenly become erratic, swinging from harshness to total disengagement. He lived alone in a quiet apartment complex where neighbors rarely saw him, except for the late-night sounds of him pacing or the occasional glimpse of his white 2015 Hyundai Elantra pulling into his spot in the early morning hours. He was a man of strict routine, following a vegan diet so rigorous that he reportedly asked his family to buy new pots and pans because his old ones might have meat residue. It was a level of control that bordered on the obsessive, a need to keep his environment sterile and his mind sharp. But beneath this sterile exterior, a different kind of obsession was taking root. Investigative data would later suggest that Kohberger's phone had pinged in the vicinity of the King Road house at least 12 times in the months leading up to the murders. These visits almost always occurred late at night or in the very early morning hours. While the students inside were sleeping or celebrating their youth, a silent observer was likely sitting in the darkness outside, learning the rhythms of the house. He was studying the layout, the entry points, and the vulnerabilities of a home that felt safe because it was full of life. He wasn't just a student of criminology anymore. He was a student of this specific location, applying his academic knowledge to a real-world target. The contrast between Kohberger and his victims was absolute. Kaylee, Maddie, Zana, and Ethan were defined by their capacity for joy and their deep ties to one another. Kohberger was defined by his isolation and his cold, intellectual distance from humanity. In his mind, people may have been little more than variables in an equation he was trying to solve. His social awkwardness, his history of being an outcast, and his intense focus on the perfect crime were converging into a dangerous singular point. He was a man who felt he was smarter than the systems designed to catch him, a man who believed he could step into the role of the predator and remain invisible. As the autumn leaves fell in Moscow and Pullman, the distance between these two worlds began to close. Kohberger continued his duties at WSU, attending classes and grading papers on the very theories of crime he was allegedly preparing to put into practice. He was hiding in plain sight, a predator dressed in the garb of a scholar. He was a shadow moving through a world of golden light, waiting for the moment when the lights at 1122 King Road would finally go out. The intersection of his clinical obsession and the vibrant lives of the four students was about to result in a collision that would forever change the landscape of the Palouse. He had spent years studying the darkness. Now he was ready to become part of it. The night of November 12, 2022, began like any other Saturday in a college town, vibrant, loud, and filled with the invincible energy of youth. But as the clock pushed past midnight into the early hours of Sunday, November 13th, the atmosphere in Moscow shifted. A biting chill settled over the Palouse, and the revelry of the evening began to dissolve into a heavy suburban silence. At 1122 King Road, the lights in the multi-level house began to flicker out one by one. The residents had returned from their various nights out. Maddie Mogan and Kaylee Goncalves had been at a local bar and a food truck. Zana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin had been at a fraternity party. By 2 a.m., the house was settling into a quiet rhythm. But outside, in the shadows of the tree line and the winding roads that skirted the campus, a white 2015 Hyundai Elantra was circling, a mechanical shark in a sea of dark asphalt. The movements of that car, captured later by a patchwork of private security cameras and doorbell feeds, told the story of a predator searching for the right moment to strike. Between 3:29 a.m. and 4:04 a.m., the vehicle was seen passing the King Road residence 3 times, each pass a calculation, each turn a refinement of a plan. Finally, at 4:04 a.m., the car made its 4th and final appearance. It executed a sharp 3-point turn in the middle of the road and came to a halt. The engine went silent. The world outside the house was still, frozen in the amber glow of the streetlights. Inside, the victims were in their beds, some asleep, one or two perhaps still drifting in the half-light of a late-night snack or a final scroll through a phone. They had no way of knowing that the sliding glass door on the second floor, an entry point that had always felt like a convenience, was about to become a breach. The entry was likely silent. The killer stepped into the kitchen area on the second floor, a space that smelled of college life, abandoned pizza boxes, the faint scent of laundry detergent, and the lingering warmth of a home. He moved with a terrifying familiarity, his destination set. He didn't wander. He didn't hesitate. He climbed the stairs to the third floor, where Maddie and Kaylee were sleeping in Maddie's bed. This was the sanctuary of two best friends, a room filled with photos and memories of a lifetime of friendship. In the darkness, the violence was sudden and absolute. The weapon, a heavy fixed-blade Ka-bar-style knife, was designed for war, not for a quiet bedroom in Idaho. Within seconds, the two girls who had spent their lives side by side were gone, their futures stolen before they could even grasp the reality of the shadow standing over them. But the nightmare was only halfway finished. The intruder descended back to the second floor. In one of the bedrooms, Zana Kernodle had recently received a DoorDash order. Her phone records would later show she was active on TikTok as late as 4:12 a.m. She was awake. She was alive. And then, she heard something. One of the surviving roommates, whose bedroom was on the second floor, would later describe being awakened by what she thought was the sound of Kaylee playing with her dog on the floor above. A short time later, she thought she heard someone say, "There's someone here." She looked out of her door but saw nothing. A few moments later, the silence was broken by the sound of muffled crying coming from Zana's room, followed by a male voice, low, calm, and bone-chillingly steady, saying something to the effect of, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." It wasn't help. It was a cold-blooded execution. The struggle in Zana's room was more pronounced, a desperate fight for survival in a narrow space. Ethan, the gentle giant who had spent the evening making his girlfriend laugh, was caught in the onslaught. The sheer brutality of the attack was a testament to the killer's focus. He was a man who had studied the physiology of death, and now he was witnessing it in real time, beneath his own hands. The air in the house grew heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the suffocating pressure of a violence so extreme it felt alien to the walls of a student rental. The surviving roommate, gripped by a paralyzing instinctual fear, opened her door for the third time. This time, she saw him. A figure clad in black, masked, moving toward her. She described him as having bushy eyebrows, a detail that would later haunt the public imagination. He didn't stop. He didn't turn toward her. He walked past her with a clinical, detached gait, heading toward the sliding glass door he had entered through minutes earlier. He left her standing in the doorway, frozen in a frozen shock phase, as he vanished back into the night. At 4:20 a.m., the white Elantra was seen on camera again, tearing away from the scene at a high rate of speed, leaving the hills of Moscow behind and disappearing toward the Washington border. Behind him, 1122 King Road was a tomb. The silence that followed was more deafening than the struggle. In the dark, 4 young hearts had stopped beating, their dreams scattered like the dust in the hallway. The survivors, traumatized and confused by the white noise of the crime, remained in their rooms, unaware of the full scale of the carnage just feet away. The sun began to rise over the Palouse, casting a pale light on a house that would soon become the center of a global investigation. The killer had done what he came to do. He had stepped out of the shadows, enacted a fantasy of total dominance, and slipped away into the morning mist, likely believing that his academic preparation and his careful evasion of the cameras had made him a ghost. He was wrong. In his wake, he had left a microscopic trail, a biological signature on a leather knife sheath left beside a victim's body, that would eventually pull the world down upon him. But for now, as the town of Moscow began to wake up, the only reality was the cold, silent horror waiting behind the front door. The sun rose over Moscow on the morning of November 13th, casting a pale, indifferent light on the quiet neighborhood around King Road. Inside the house, a heavy, unnatural silence had replaced the typical Sunday morning sounds of waking students. It wasn't until nearly noon that the first tremors of the coming earthquake were felt. The surviving roommates, having finally ventured out of their rooms, encountered a scene so horrific that the mind instinctively refused to process it. Chaos soon followed. Friends were called, a 911 report was made concerning an unconscious person, and the first responders arrived at a scene that would haunt their professional careers forever. As the yellow crime scene tape began to unfurl around the property, the town of Moscow began to realize that its long era of safety had ended in a single night of unimaginable violence. The news broke like a physical blow. Initially, the details were sparse, but the reality was undeniable. 4 University of Idaho students, Maddie, Kaylee, Zana, and Ethan, were dead. The shock was immediate and total. This was a community where people left their cars running while they ran into the store, and where the blue light emergency poles on campus felt more like relics of a more dangerous world than a necessity. Suddenly, that world had arrived on their doorstep. For the next 48 days, Moscow became a city under siege, not by an army, but by a shadow. The atmosphere transformed from one of collegiate vibrancy to one of stifling, suffocating fear. Students who had once walked the campus paths alone at night now moved in groups, their keys clutched between their knuckles. The local hardware stores sold out of deadbolts and window locks within 48 hours. Every creak of a floorboard or rustle of wind against a window became a potential intruder. The investigation began in a state of high-pressure silence. Local police, joined quickly by the Idaho State Police and a massive contingent from the FBI, moved with a clinical precision that the public mistook for inactivity. For weeks, the authorities held back the most gruesome details of the crime, leading to a vacuum of information that was quickly filled by the internet's dark speculation. True crime detectives on social media began dissecting every pixel of the victims' digital lives, casting suspicion on grieving friends, family members, and even the surviving roommates. The rumors were a secondary trauma for a town already in mourning. While the public demanded an immediate arrest, the investigators were sifting through thousands of tips and thousands of hours of grainy surveillance footage, looking for a needle in a haystack of digital noise. The search for the ghost led to the identification of a specific vehicle, a white Hyundai Elantra. This car became the focal point of the investigation's public face. Police across the country were told to look for a 2011 to 2013 model, though the actual vehicle was a 2015. While the public looked for the car, the FBI was already working on a much more sophisticated hunt. They were analyzing cellular tower pings and utilizing forensic genealogy, a cutting-edge technique that uses public DNA databases to build family trees. On the 3rd floor of the King Road house, the killer had left behind a singular, fatal mistake, a tan leather knife sheath. On the button snap of that sheath, a single trace of male DNA had been recovered. It was a microscopic calling card, a biological signature that the killer likely believed he had cleaned, or that wouldn't matter in the absence of a direct match in a criminal database. As November turned into a freezing December, the pressure on the Moscow Police Department became unbearable. National news outlets camped out on the streets, their bright lights illuminating the dark, snowy hills. Every press conference was a gauntlet of pointed questions about why there were no suspects and why the community should still feel safe. The police chief, visibly exhausted, repeated the same mantra. They were following the evidence, and they were committed to justice. Behind the scenes, the net was tightening. They had identified a white Elantra at Washington State University, just a short drive away in Pullman. The owner was a graduate student named Bryan Kohberger. They had his name, they had his car, and now they needed his DNA to bridge the gap between suspicion and a warrant. The search followed Kohberger across the country. Shortly after the fall semester ended, he began a cross-country drive with his father, returning to Pennsylvania for the winter break. They were followed every mile of the way. FBI teams watched as the Elantra moved through the heart of America, stop after stop, while the legal team in Idaho worked to finalize the evidence. In the early morning hours of December 30th, the silence finally broke. A tactical team descended on the Kohberger family home in the Pocono Mountains. The ghost was no longer a shadow. He was a man in handcuffs. In Moscow, the news of the arrest brought a wave of relief so powerful it felt like a collective exhale. But the relief was tempered by a new, chilling realization. The suspect wasn't a local drifter or a random intruder. He was a scholar of the law, a man who lived among them, who had potentially sat in the same coffee shops and walked the same streets, while the town lived in terror. The 48 days of fear had ended, but the long journey toward understanding why was just beginning. The community began to gather for vigils, the golden light of thousands of candles reflecting off the snow as they started the slow, painful process of reclamation. They had found their suspect, but they still had to find a way to live in a world where such darkness was possible. The arrest of Bryan Kohberger in the early hours of December 30th, 2022, was not the result of a single smoking gun, but rather the culmination of a massive multi-agency effort that wove together traditional detective work with cutting-edge digital and biological surveillance. When the tactical teams moved in on the Kohberger family home in Chestnut Hill Township, Pennsylvania, they weren't just acting on a hunch. They were the final hammer blow in an investigation that had spent weeks meticulously building a net around a man who had gone to great lengths to remain invisible. This phase of the case shifted the focus from the grief-stricken streets of Moscow to the clinical, high-tech labs of the FBI and the sprawling digital records of cellular providers and automotive databases. The first critical piece of the puzzle was the white 2015 Hyundai Elantra. While the public had been looking for a slightly older model based on initial police requests, investigators were narrowing their search by cross-referencing surveillance footage with vehicle registration records at nearby Washington State University. They discovered that a student named Bryan Kohberger had registered a white 2015 Elantra and had even changed his license plate from Pennsylvania to Washington just days after the murders. This wasn't illegal, but in the context of a quadruple homicide where a similar car was seen fleeing the scene, it was a significant red flag. Analysts began a deep dive into his background, discovering a man who was deeply embedded in the study of the criminal mind, a PhD student in criminology who likely understood exactly how the police would try to catch him. But car sightings were circumstantial. To bridge the gap to a search warrant, the investigation turned to the digital trail Kohberger left in his wake. Investigators served geofence warrants and requested cellular data from towers serving the Moscow and Pullman areas. The results were staggering. They found that Kohberger's phone had pinged near 1122 King Road at least 12 times in the months leading up to the attack, often in the late hours of the night or the early hours of the morning. On the night of the murders, however, his phone went dark. Records showed the device was turned off or placed in airplane mode at 2:47 a.m., just as he was allegedly leaving Pullman. It did not reappear on the network until 4:48 a.m., south of Moscow, as he was making a circuitous route back to his apartment. This 2-hour gap aligned perfectly with the timeline of the murders, suggesting a deliberate attempt to evade cellular tracking during the commission of the crime. While the digital net was tightening, a biological breakthrough was brewing in a lab hundreds of miles away. During the initial processing of the crime scene, investigators had recovered a tan leather knife sheath on the 3rd floor, lying on the bed next to Maddie Mogan. This was the killer's most significant oversight. Forensic technicians managed to extract a single source of male DNA from the button snap of that sheath. This was the biological signature the team needed. However, Kohberger's DNA was not in any criminal database. To find their match, the FBI utilized investigative genetic genealogy, the same revolutionary technique used to catch the Golden State Killer. They uploaded the profile to public ancestry databases, building a family tree that eventually pointed directly toward the Kohberger family in Pennsylvania. To confirm their suspicions without tipping off the suspect, investigators had to get creative. While Kohberger was home in Pennsylvania for winter break, agents conducted a covert trash pull at his parents' residence. They sifted through the family's discarded items and recovered DNA from Kohberger's father. Lab results showed that the DNA found on the trash was a 99.99% match for the father of the person who left DNA on the knife sheath in Idaho. It was the definitive link. The DNA on the sheath belonged to Bryan Kohberger. This biological evidence, combined with the cellular tracking and the identification of his car, provided the probable cause necessary for a judge to sign off on the arrest and search warrants. The investigation didn't stop with the arrest. Once Kohberger was in custody and his Pullman apartment and Pennsylvania home were searched, more pieces of the puzzle began to surface. Investigators found a collection of dark clothing and a computer that showed he had been following the news of the Moscow murders with obsessive detail. They also discovered that he had allegedly messaged one of the victims on Instagram multiple times in the weeks before the attack, though she had never responded. This pointed to a targeted stalking behavior, a predator who had chosen his victims and spent months studying them before finally deciding to act. The forensic investigation into the Idaho student murders remains one of the most complex in modern history. It showcased a new era of policing where a killer can no longer rely on a lack of a criminal record to stay hidden. Every digital interaction, every microscopic trace of skin or hair, and every captured frame of a security camera is a potential witness. Kohberger, a man who studied these very systems, found himself trapped by the very technology he likely thought he could manipulate. He had tried to be a ghost, but in the end, he was undone by a single button snap and a trail of cellular pings that told the story of his movements better than any eyewitness ever could. The digital and biological net had closed, and for the families of the victims, it was the first step toward a justice that had once felt as distant as the stars. The road to justice for the families of Maddie, Kaylee, Zana, and Ethan was long and filled with agonizing procedural delays. For years, Bryan Kohberger's defense team filed motion after motion, challenging everything from the use of investigative genetic genealogy to the venue of the trial itself. The case was eventually moved from Latah County to Boise to ensure a fair trial, but the weight of the evidence continued to mount. By the time 2025 arrived, the prosecution had built a fortress of forensic data. The DNA on the knife sheath, the digital footprint of his cellular pings, and the video evidence of his white Elantra. The perfect crime Kohberger may have envisioned was unraveling under the scrutiny of a judicial system he had spent his life studying. In July 2025, the legal chess match reached an abrupt and somber conclusion. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, Bryan Kohberger stood before a silent, packed courtroom and entered a guilty plea to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. It was a moment of profound gravity. The man who had spent months maintaining a mask of clinical detachment finally admitted to the unthinkable. For the families seated in the gallery, the plea was a double-edged sword. It avoided the trauma of a protracted, gruesome trial, but it also forced them to hear the word guilty from the lips of the man who had stolen their children's futures. The sentencing hearing was a powerful testament to the lives lost. One by one, the families stood to deliver victim impact statements, describing the hollow silence left behind in their homes. They spoke of the graduations that never happened, the weddings that would never take place, and the birthdays marked only by visits to a cemetery. The judge, noting the calculated and unfathomably cruel nature of the crimes, delivered the final blow. Kohberger was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for burglary. There was no chance of redemption, no hope of release. The net that had begun with a single microscopic trace of DNA had finally, permanently closed. The house at 1122 King Road no longer stands. In late 2023, the university demolished the structure, turning the site of such profound darkness into an empty lot of quiet earth, a physical erasure of a nightmare that the community desperately needed. But while the building is gone, the memory of Kaylee, Maddie, Zana, and Ethan remains etched into the spirit of Moscow. The Palouse has regained its silence, but it is a different kind of quiet now, one tempered by a loss of innocence and a permanent awareness of the fragility of peace. Bryan Kohberger's legacy is not one of a perfect crime, but of a profound failure of the human spirit, undone by the very systems he thought he could outsmart. Justice, in its final form, was not a grand gesture, but a somber admission of guilt in a Boise courtroom, ensuring he will never again step into the light. As the snow falls over the hills of Idaho, it covers a landscape forever changed, reminding us that while evil can strike in the shadows, it is the light of community and the persistence of truth that ultimately prevails. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.